Self-illuminating geometry is an option in situations when the environment background is not sufficient to meet production goals. For example, because we're using a shading network to provide the environment here, we can't see a preview in the viewport. Let's go into the rendering menu and choose environment. Earlier in the course, we assigned an RGB multiply node here in the environment map, and that's not supported in the viewport here. But if we used self-illuminating geometry, we'd be able to work around that problem. Even if we could see the background here, adjusting it in the frame might be challenging because setting the mapping coordinates in the bitmap node is tedious and has limitations. Self-illumination would give us the ability to frame the background by simply manipulating an object here in the viewport. Self-illumination would also enable a more complex setup with multiple background layers. Maybe you want a spherical sky and additional matte paintings. You could map those onto planes or cylinders. We would need to control to what extent those backdrop objects are affected by scene lighting. For the sky, of course, we would want full self-illumination. Even if we just wanted to render our scene against black to avoid matte fringe, we would want to employ self-illuminated geometry. Earlier, we saw that the MR Physical Sky node allows a custom background that doesn't affect the lighting, and we exploited that feature to render against black. But if we want to use our own map to generate reflections while keeping the background black, we can turn the environment off and build our own environment that can be invisible to the camera and yet still generate reflections. By the way, this technique for rendering against black will only work for Final Gather. Let's look at the render settings window. Go to render setup. We are using Final Gathering currently, and that means we can render against black without any problem. But if we chose the indirect diffuse GI method, then we wouldn't be able to render against black, because in that case, the object must be visible to the camera. We can still combine self-illumination with indirect diffuse GI. We just can't render against a black background. All right, so let's set this up with Final Gather. First thing we'll do is turn off Use Map here. If you turn off the environment, you will affect the lighting. And if you're using indirect diffuse GI, it will affect the lighting very drastically because the environment provides both specular reflections and suffuse illumination from the sky. In this case, we're using Final Gather, and turning off the environment will disable specular highlights and reflections, and that will darken the shot. But our suffuse illumination is actually coming from the skylight, not the environment. Let's check in on that skylight. Press the H key to display Select from Scene and open up Compass 001 and double-click Daylight 001. And in the Modify panel, we can see that Sunlight and Skylight are both active. By turning off the environment map here, we've just disabled the reflections, but the suffuse illumination from the skylight is still active. We can choose to emit suffuse light from the self-illuminated backdrop, either in addition to or instead of the skylight. But I don't want my lighting to change. I just want to be able to manipulate the environment in the viewport. So I'm going to leave the skylight on, and I'm going to choose to not emit light from the backdrop. Let's create that backdrop. I'll close this window and go out to a 4 viewport layout with Alt-W. Go to the Create panel, choose Sphere, and click and drag near the origin. Release the mouse, and then right-click to exit sphere creation. With it still selected, go over to the Modify panel. We'll make it very large, 5,000 meters in radius. Increase its level of detail, set the segments to 120. And let's just place it at the origin. With it still selected, choose the Move tool and set the X and Y values in the transform type in to 0. X of 0, Y of 0, and Z is already at 0. Then we can dolly back in the perspective or any view. If we back out enough in the perspective view, we can see the front surface or the outside of the sphere. We want to turn the sphere inside out. And to do that, we'll add a normal modifier. With the sphere still selected, go to the modifier list and scroll down looking for normal. Add the normal modifier. And flip normals is on by default. And we can see what happens when we turn that on and off. We want it to be on. Now, finally, we want to adjust the object properties for the sphere. With it still selected, right-click and go to Object Properties. And in the Object Properties, make sure that we are adjusting those properties by object. It says by object here and here. If it says by layer, then you want to click that button and turn it off. Under Display Properties, we want to enable Backface Cull. And that's just a convenience so that in the viewport, when we dolly back, we can see through the sphere. But much more importantly, in the rendering control, we want to make sure we disable cast and receive shadows. And now the sunlight will be able to reach our scene. All right, click OK. And we can dolly forward and we can see that now we can look through the sphere. All right, that's our layout for an environment sphere. And now we're ready to assign a self-illuminated material in the following movie.